I think the genesis of this meeting is to focus more on the current state of like SaaS, spend, not just the spend, but like the current state of SaaS, especially in cyber. Josh shared a stat with us. He said, you know, compared to every HR product, there's 3 to 4x the time of cybersecurity vendors that a particular company, deals with. I think you guys are obviously we're living that dream, right? We're always competing for time with the CISOs and the senior leadership. And what makes things difficult in cyber is there's a lot of overlap. There's multiple overlaps between products. There's a lot of features that are supposed to be a feature that's actually a product. What 8,000 vendors out there. You can take a wild guess, maybe 30-40% of them should be just features, right? So from Josh's perspective, we would love to hear from him, and let's bring this a collaborative discussion to understand how do we differentiate ourselves? How do we stand out? How do we, what there are things that we cannot skip, like onboarding, implementation, and stuff like that. But when it comes to the run stage, when it comes to ROI, there are things we can do to differentiate ourselves, and that's the conversation we want to have today. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Josh, and happy to have you on board.
Awesome. Thanks, Shareth. Appreciate that lovely introduction. Yeah, great to meet everybody today. I've got a few slides that I want to go through, just sort of set the context for the conversation, but I would love for this to be an open dialogue. Let's talk about your challenges. Let's talk about what you've seen that's worked well, and let's just kind of go through it. But I'll pull up some slides just to, like I said, kind of help us frame up the discussion for today. So here's today's agenda. Excuse the pun, I can't help myself, but we're going to talk about some SASE life cycles after we discuss the challenges. Shareth kind of introduced that nicely. And then we'll kind of go in deep into setting the framework for how we think about the life cycle and some best practices that I've seen from our side that's kind of worked for us and for some of our customers, some of our vendors as well. So jumping into it, Shareth already hit on a lot of it. Who am I? So I did about 12 years in cybersecurity consulting at PwC, so I've seen quite a lot of things. On the services side, we are all things to all people all the time. So we had to sell our own projects, we had to deliver our own projects, we had to manage our P&Ls. And so I got a lot of very fast exposure to a lot of things. For the last 2.5 years, I've been over at a company called Productiv as the VP of IT and information security. But more importantly, as Shareth said, I love to travel. I love to play rugby. Just some shots of different places that I've been over the years. On the right, my lovely wife on the photo on the bottom left corner. Met her in Brazil 14 years ago. Shareth has met her a couple times as well, and we've been together kind of ever since. So that's who I am. Want to bring a little bit of context today. So yes, I am a consumer of our own vendors. I also have to deal with us being a vendor to our customers. But additionally, and I promise this isn't a sales pitch, it's kind of relevant to some of the things we'll talk about today. Productiv is a SaaS management company. So we give visibility into a company's SaaS portfolio, so software as a service. Obviously, that's what we're talking about. We give visibility to the depth of license usage, allocation, how that compares against your contracts. We empower teams to make decisions around renewals, et cetera. And from all of those things, you can see we get the visibility, see the entire ecosystem, and start to strategize to take those actions. We've been able to pull out some really interesting statistics. And so Shareth was kind of hitting on some of these things, but we put out an annual state of SaaS report based on all the data we're seeing from our customers and their application portfolios. And SaaS spend continues to accelerate. So we've broken it out here by enterprise, medium, and small market. And the average cost per employee, SaaS spend specifically, is hovering at around 10K plus. At the enterprise level, you can get some economies of scale. You see organizations start to consolidate down into suites and things like that. So they're getting better price per employee. But on average, we're seeing these things continue to rise, especially if you're talking about a small organization. 10,000 per employee is a lot. This slide is really where I think it starts to bring those challenges together that Shareth was starting to talk about, though. The average, just talking about how busy it is out there. The average company these days has over 300 SaaS applications in the portfolio, 40% of which, and these are like, we have these statistics, we can see actual usage, 40% of all licenses go unused. That's problematic. When you're talking to a CISO, you're talking to a CIO, they understand that a lot of their portfolio is going unused. Nothing drives me more as a consumer of our vendors, nothing drives me crazier than shelfware. We chased a shiny ball. We didn't set good expectations of the value that we were going to get out of it. There wasn't a champion. It just sat there and it went unused. Drives me insane because what you've basically done at that point is just taken a pile of cash, lit it on fire, and watched it burn. Except I think I would enjoy watching the pile of cash burn more, right? Um, and what did that translate to? Well, we're seeing an average of $20,000 overspent per app because we've over permissioned it. We bought too many licenses. We didn't negotiate well enough, whatever it was. There's redundancies. So I know Shareth talked about some of that. We have multiple tools that do similar things. Well, that's also waste, right? So like we're seeing on average over $20,000 overspent per application. And how does that tie really down into the security compliance space? I think this impacts a lot of you. We're seeing 2 times more applications in the space than anywhere else. So if an HR team has 15, 20 applications that are specific to them, we're seeing 40, 50 applications in the security and compliance space. So you're just competing for time and capacity with a lot of other vendors out there. So I want to stop here, like before we start getting into the frameworks and things like that. Does this resonate with all of you? Is this what you're seeing when you're going to market? Like, are you seeing similar challenges? Are there other challenges that you all are facing?
I hear every CISO I talk to says, I have too many vendors. I want a platform that can do it all. But Josh, do me a favor. I know you're a rugby player, so I'm not going to mess with you, but can you keep that overspend number a little quiet? Because it's going to kill our numbers.
Sure. Sure. Well, and this is what I want to talk about today. My storyline today isn't to I'm not going to talk to other seasons like, oh, cut your spend, cut your spend. It's uh CISOs and companies don't cut spend where they're getting value. And that's my message today is how do we actually define that value and track it and communicate it to these buyers so they understand and they want to go to bat for you. Right. So that trust me, I get it. We're also a SaaS provider ourselves. So that doesn't play well for us either. But we have to acknowledge that this is the challenge that we're facing. This is what we have to overcome because we're fighting for time, we're fighting for resources, we're fighting for money that these buyers want to go then potentially spend other places. So how do we differentiate ourselves? But Peter, I totally hear you.
So my experience is that you plant the seeds for success and high adoption at onboarding. So it's well documented, well attended by the right people. And there's some type of a follow-up. So you can validate that your product or service has become sticky. And that can just carry on through your touch points and QBRs to maintain that. But I think this is a great service that your platform provides these IT leaders some insight into what's working and more importantly, what's not working.
Thank you for that. I promise Peter's not a plant, but he does lead directly into some of my next points. So
Yeah,
thank you.
can I make a comment back to that?
Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
a question for the community is to what extent are you taking the ROI story with your customers? In the sense, let's say your buyer is a CISO, obviously he should be knowing what value you're providing, how they're extracting value with usage metrics and whatever else you do. But how many people are actually taking beyond the CISO to perhaps the procurement team, right? Perhaps
CFO.
to the CFO. I mean, I want to share a success story. I learned this from Peter because we talk a lot about these challenges. I had a lot of customers who were ghosting us, the long tail customers, and the people who bought the product kind of abandoned it for probably similar reasons we're talking about here. I started writing directly to the CFO of the company because this has got to hurt somewhere, right? Somebody's paying those bills. And I was able to get so much better traction to get those guys back to the discussion table by getting the CFOs engaged. And I took that to another level. I went to some of our happy customers and said, look, if every 6 months I sent you a report about how your company is extracting value from our product, would you appreciate that? They're like, absolutely, yes. I feel like that's one way we can differentiate ourselves from other vendors is to be able to, far reach into the organization so that when it comes to, spending cuts, we're not a stranger.
Yeah, hi, Katie here. I'm with OneTrust, privacy software. And I just want to jump in and share is that when it comes to compliance, right? So that's a must. So when we sell a product or service, it's a must. Um, it's a little bit more straightforward. That says, though, the conversation that we have is not just the CISOs anymore. Someone just said earlier is that procurement actually in the conversation, right? So that we can actually show the value and they actually deep dive into the service that they're getting. So they get the product functionality, they sort of dive into the service, what else on top of the software that we provide. So I just want to share that that's what I'm seeing here at OneTrust.
Great.
Yeah, and completely agree with that. And that's something that we push ourselves is to like our product itself, because like I said, we help drive renewals and things like that. We're firm believers that renewals are much more efficient for the entire organization when you're bringing all the relevant stakeholders to the table. So that's finance, that's procurement, that's security, so that we can do our security reviews as a part of it. We get forgotten all the time. It's the IT teams that they can help align on their strategy and vision, right? So it's bringing all the relevant people to the table, and it's the same thing if you're a seller to them, right? Like you have to understand that those are all potential buyers, they're all potential stakeholders, and so you need to account for all of those. So yeah, totally agree. So just moving us along a little bit, because I do want to talk about some of the, at least what we've seen be successful and some things to consider. But before we go into that, I couldn't help myself. Little SaaS circle of life for you, a little Lion King reference if anybody likes it. But this is the sort of life cycle that we tend to orient around. It's not earth-shattering. Many of you probably already think about it. I just think it's helpful to articulate it. Going through these like intake, and I was just talking to our VP of product about it a couple of days ago. She's like, well, when you talk about intake, what about sourcing and things like that? And to me, it's all in one. When we're going through intake, it may be a competitive bid. You may have to go through an RFP. They may be very mature in their process as your buyer, where they have a defined set of requirements for what they're looking for, and you can compare against it. But oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes, we have our BDRs, SDRs that are cold calling. We have our AEs that are out there trying to sell. We're trying to invent sort of the space of like, hey, here's the challenge, and educate some of our buyers on what that may be. And there's all the processes that have to go in of security reviews and all of that. So that's the upfront intake. The implementation side, what I mean by implementation is like the actual technical implementation. What does it take to stand up your application? If you're having to deploy network sensors, if you're having to get your application behind the customer's SSO, like that's all the technical parts of it. The operationalization side, what I mean by this is really the education and awareness. What are the end users? What are the consumers of it? What are their use cases? And then the run state, I was just talking to Omid and Shareth about this before the call kicked off. Even though all these boxes are sort of equal size, they're not equal size in the life cycle. The majority of the life cycle lives at the run state. 90 to 95% of the duration of your life cycle is in the run state. This is the actual consumption of your product. Renewals and offboarding, we're not going to get into renewals. That's just contracting. And if you're doing all these other things well, the renewal part ideally is easy. And offboarding, we're trying to avoid at all costs, right? That's the purpose of talking about it today. So the focus, as you can see with the orange line, is going to be on these first 4 boxes. But does this life cycle sort of resonate with everybody? I think everybody kind of aligned on this being. See general head nods. Awesome. Oh, and one other thing on the previous slide before we go further, I had this in a speaker's note, forgot to mention it. Another thing to kind of orient around this is the marketplace that we're all selling into today. What we've seen over the last few years is the percent of 1-year contracts is continuously on the rise. Because there's so much innovation happening in the marketplace right now, because there's so much uncertainty, companies are trying to consolidate, to conserve resources. We're not having to go deal with these renewals every year. So these things have to happen continuously now because we're having to go resell ourselves every year. So I did want to point that out. Cool. So here are some best practices that I've seen from the intake side. Peter, that's why I laughed about you being a plant, because we're talking about exactly some of these things. And this happens from the very beginning, is level setting on what the customer challenges are and understanding their requirements. So I said, if you're dealing with a mature company, they may have already articulated all their requirements because their procurement team may force them to, but frequently we're not. And so what often happens, I mean, I've seen it, we've been a culprit of it internally, or before I came in, where we chase kind of the shiny ball, especially in the age of AI. Like, oh, there's this AI tool, just throw AI at it. We're like, okay, well, what's the actual challenge that you're trying to solve? And what are the technical requirements to make sure that we're actually delivering on that? And then defining what that target state is. So focusing on what those customer outcomes are. And some of this does take education to the customer, right? Your sales team may be great and they come in, they're like, oh, we're going to reduce your risk by 30%. And they're like, awesome. But like, but which risks? What are the actual technical specifics of what you're trying to solve for? And get that agreement early on, because if there's any kind of disagreement here, you're going to be starting on the wrong foot, because you're always going to be chasing after the customer's expectations from day one. And that last bullet there is just like, as it comes to contracting, this helps protect you all. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir. I'm sure you all are very well aware of this. There's certain things that you don't want to specifically call out in contracts, because then you kind of have to really do it. But if the customer has really firm things and expectations, just go ahead and get them codified in the contract. That'll help you hold your teams accountable. It'll hold the customer accountable, because if they try to go with scope creep of like, no, we wanted more, and you're like, well, it's here in the contract, right? Like, we don't want to have to anchor to that, but just as a sort of a CYA, it's a nice to have there. Thoughts, comments, questions on this? This isn't the meatiest part of it, but I do think, as Peter said before, setting these expectations from day one will really it'll set you up for success long term.
Yeah, Josh, this is Nooper. Sorry, I can't be on video, but I
Okay.
totally agree with these four. And one of the things that I've observed is that defining those customer challenges, or documenting the requirements, it is so variable on the maturity of the customer as well. Any strategies that you have seen that works for, I'll say, customers who are not as mature? They kind of are just trying it out, and they're even trying to figure out as they go through the product or the service.
Totally. Shareth will laugh. I'll take off my CISO hat and I'll put on my consulting hat again. Yeah, accelerators and templates. I'm a huge proponent of those. So when I was talking about educating your customers, your buyers, they may not know all the requirements that they should be thinking about, one, in this particular market space, but also the technical capabilities of your product. So this is also like, hey, it's almost a reflection of your feature sets, right? But come with a checklist. Hey, this is when we're focusing on the outcomes. This, like, if we can agree on the value proposition of it, these are the technical requirements to meet those, and kind of work backwards from it. So like, give them a starting point. I always say it's easier for people to tell you what something isn't than to tell you what it is. If you give them a blank whiteboard and a marker, they're just going to stare at you. If you have like a 14-step template and hand them the marker, they're going to start going, nope, not that. Oh, it's actually this. Like, you're just going to get a lot more engagement from it.
Yeah, no, I agreed. It's for us, it's been the conversation starts with, okay, here's the three most common use cases, and if you're doing this use cases, this is probably what's important. Are we spot on, and so on. So I agree. Yeah.
Peter, look like you bring up.
Yeah, you bring up a great point on the maturity. Something that I initiated about a year ago was having the conversation with a CISO, and my conversation was focused toward AppSec, because there's a lot of noise and a lot of competition there. And what we did is a maturity assessment conversation. Like, where are you in that journey, and really, where do you want to take it? And that can extend beyond just application security, because they're looking for a platform that can do a lot of different things. But it starts with, it's a check the box. I'm a CISO, I got to check the box because I need application security, all the way up to they've got a very engaged DevOps a team that is highly engaged in using the product and providing feedback. So great point, Nupur, bringing up the maturity aspect.
Yeah, and that's why I like to start with defining the customer challenges, because I know us as product companies, we like to focus on the value, but every value may not apply directly to that particular customer. And so aligning with them, getting agreement with them of like, hey, this is the challenge. So to your point, Peter, like maybe the challenge is that they have to meet a compliance requirement. Okay, cool. Well, maybe that's check the box and fine, you're happy. But maybe your challenges are that you're continuously finding insecurities in your code pipeline. Okay, well, how do we start to address that? How do we minimize that risk? So yeah, agree with everybody. Moving to the next step is implementation. And so this is where we start to really refine and track these things. And so we do this internally for every one of our deployments. I know my customer success team, they have this for every one of our customers, is creating a mutual action plan. So, the sales side up front is we agree on what the target outcomes are going to be. But in order to get to those outcomes, we all have to take certain steps. And a lot of times customers just say, okay, well, I just want to be turnkey. What's your team going to do to all of a sudden start delivering all this value? As we all know, there's always a shared responsibility model. Sometimes the shared responsibility leans heavier towards the customer. Sometimes it's less on the customer. Ideally, it's less on the customer. They're always happier when it is that way. But we need to, I would recommend that we set this mutual action plan so that we have actual names attributed to dates, attributed to actions. It ensures that both sides are holding each other accountable. And then a secondary part of this is defining the definition of done. I've experienced it myself. I know that I've seen it happen on some engagements that I've supported, where I feel like the implementation just never ends. There's always an extra ask from the customer. There's always another thing they want to do, and that's fine. That's just part of maturing the usage and adoption of the platform. There's always going to be changes, but we need to align, okay, what is the actual implementation phase and what's going to be delivered at the end of it, get agreement to it. And then once we hit that, get the sign off from the customer, because otherwise they're always going to keep, oh no, we're still in implementation. Or you still haven't fully delivered. And you never hit that run state, which is where you really should be living. I see a lot of head nods, so I'll stop there.
That is so spot on. I found, when I was taking a look at our onboarding, customers that were 10, 11, 12 months in onboarding, because we allowed the customer to throw everything in the kitchen sink in there. I brought it back, regardless of size, no onboarding would go beyond 120 days. And then there's validation checkpoints after that. But you're missing great opportunities if, there's additional work or something that needs to be done. That's your professional services opportunity. We can actually generate revenue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Somewhat of a tough question for you guys. Every once in a while, you see these customers who pretty much don't give you that sign off, and they're going to hold you hostage for a few enhancement requests or bugs that has to get fixed before they give you the sign off. How do you deal with those customers?
You got to start up front. You got to say, this is what we're going to do in the onboarding, and you document it. Or you've got those requirements in the contract, like Josh said. So you've got to reference that back. Customer success needs to manage the customer as well. And there's always those outliers that are going to hold you hostage, and you literally need to take a hard line and just say, listen, we're beyond that. We already defined what done is, and we've already gone the extra mile. Now it's time to bring in our professional services team to let's really examine what your requirements are here and see how we can help.
Yeah, it's a tough spot, but unfortunately, that's when I think management needs to step in and start, being the bad guy, whether they like it or not. At least start pushing them in that direction. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I've found too. I mean, Peter, I think you said 120 days is where you're kind of targeting deployment, and I'm seeing a lot more customers say, "Hey, we need to get this done in like 90 days." And so, what we've been doing to kind of deal with some of those expectations is that we will clearly define, obviously work with customer, understand what their use case is, and then basically just tell them, hey, tell the customer, here are the top 3 things that we're going to do to give you that basic level of functionality to be able to handle that use case. So doing that within 90 days, and then doing the adoption phase after that to have more custom work for the customers. And that seemed to work pretty well, so far.
Yeah, and I agree with that point in the sense that what I've normally seen is the way customer defines a bug or something sometimes might not be, especially if they are focused on the what part rather than the why part, because sometimes we come in and we can say, okay, this is how we see industry and different customers doing it. And this is how it worked. This is how we recommend. And oftentimes having that more open-ended dialogue usually makes them see the point and see if they need to look at it differently and all that. Yes, there could be 10% cases where there is genuinely a bug or an extension of use case, which would require further development or R&D's engineering to come in. But 90% of the time I've seen either there is a good workaround in place or maybe the way they look at it has to be looked at it differently going forward.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to just making sure that everyone really understands the impact of these requests, right? As far as like, what is the impact to the operator that's using your platform that they need this feature request done, right? So we handle that. Obviously, everyone on this call probably handles that as well. It's just like sometimes it's very, very tough, and you get on the call, you make commitments on when you can deliver, but yeah, it's about just objective handling, I guess.
Yeah, great conversation. Love that. The only other thing I'll point out here is I have that third bullet, define platform KPIs. I separate this out from sort of value ROI measurement. This is like just for the platform itself, especially if we're talking about I don't know, network implementations and all these other types of things. Like, what are the core KPIs for your platform to ensure that like it's up and running and healthy? So that we can mitigate some of these things. Oh, I think there's a bug. Oh, well, no, it's just misconfigured, right? So like, let's actually make sure the platform is running as expected. And we have some of those things to measure. I don't know, there's a 2-click there. The next step is around the operationalization. And this is where we're actually talking about use case and adoption. So that first point around like define the target use cases. This is tying back to the intake side of what's the value proposition. So here we should really talk about our platform, and I'm sure all of your platforms can do hundreds of things, but tying back to the real challenges and requirements from the customer, what are the first 3 to 5 use cases that they really want to solve for? Let's not boil the ocean. Let's really talk. Let's focus on the biggest hitters. They get to what does the customer expect to use the platform for? Because not every customer wants to use your platform the same way. Never seen anybody more creative than a customer. Right? They're both in terms of stress testing your platform as well as finding new and innovative ways to use it. The second thing is defining the adoption targets and usage metrics. The 2 screenshots on the right are from our product. They're like, don't worry about that. It's however I'm sure you all have your own internal measurements, whether you're using Amplitude or whatever it is to measure adoption of your capabilities. But measure it by things like team adoption, use case adoption. What features are they using? You can probably infer from what's here. This is a Zoom view. So like attended meeting, hosted meeting, like things like that, right? Really look and see where there's laggards against the adoption of those agreed upon use cases and ask the question, why? Did they miss out on the education? Did they need additional training? Is there a misalignment against the expected use case and what that individual team needs it for? There's different drivers, right? But you can't address what you can't see. So you got to start by measuring those types of things to be able to infer some of the challenges and put pressure where it's needed. And then continuing to align with the customer on their obligations, because all too often they'll continue to try to defer to you and say, oh, like we're not getting the value that we want. We're not getting the value that you want. And like, okay, well, like what have you taken the time to go educate your admins? So like, are they adopting? Do they know? Are they experiencing friction in actually getting the value, whether it be vulnerability alerts? Okay, what do I do with them? Where do I find them? How do those tie into our existing processes? Maybe there's technical deficiencies. Maybe you need to go hire for it and you didn't think about that up front. So just being very clear in that shared responsibility model for those use cases, what's their responsibility versus what's yours. Any thoughts on this, or interesting ways that you all are measuring your use cases? Obviously, every application is different, but
Yeah, I can add that, I mean, every application is different. Back in the day that we were just reliant on the number of users, user-based, perhaps we didn't have the tools or even the mindset to keep track of the adoption. We will make sure that if a customer bought 100 licenses for their support organization or HR, in the case of success factors, that those 100 people actually daily logged in and were able to do something. That way we could know that there won't be a risk for downsell or even down the stream churn. Now, with the consumption becoming so central, even for user base, but as you think about consumption-based and usage-based pricing or business model, you need to be more aware of the depth of the product usage. And I do think, and your point is spot on. It's not just usage, but also use case. Every time we have a conversation with a customer, trying to identify the next use case, or if they have 3 use cases on the docket and they've only deployed one, what about second and third one? Because use cases drive consumption as well.
Yeah.
yeah. And oh, please go ahead, Nipur.
Yeah, I was going to just add, agree with everything that's said, and if you can, as a customer success or an engineer or a business person, influence the product team to include the dashboard as part of the product versus something that's on the back end. That is really where, one, vendors can influence, 2, you can really make that front and center with your customers, because otherwise it's really hard to connect the dots after the work.
Yeah, I love that. It's a great idea.
You really want to be transparent with the customer, right, Nipur?
Yeah, well, oh, well, we'll talk about that in another unrecorded call, as they say, right? But that's where some of the companies I work with, that was the one that made a difference, and even allowing these migrations to the usage pricing models and those kind of things. It makes that conversation so much easier.
In my opinion, this is absolutely the most it's the most important thing to do. I mean, if you're not doing this at a minimum, providing visibility and transparency, then you're going to be definitely behind. Every CISO that I've talked to, and when I put out material on how their team is extracting value and what are some of the metrics that come out of it, that really catches their attention and they want to see more of it. And I love your point about Nipur, is having the product team make this a part of the product feature, as opposed to then having a third party, let's say CSP, to be able to provide this, because they can only also have limitations on how they do this stuff. So no doubt.
Yeah, and a secondary thing, that second screenshot on the bottom that I thought was interesting, and the reason why I included it, is the benchmarking piece. So this is being realistic to yourself. What does normal adoption look like? What is a really heavy adopter, tier A customer for you look like? What is a lagger? At what point should you be concerned? Is this like a leading indicator, loss leader, that this customer may churn? Something like that. And so, like, just be realistic and benchmark against your own customers and how they're doing. And that kind of leads into my last slide here, which is the run state. And as we talked about, this is the longest portion of the life cycle of your application. Hopefully, hopefully they're not putting it in, ripping it right back out. And this is something that I'm sure many of you already have, but defining a health score. So what does it mean to actually be a healthy customer? What does it mean to see that they're getting consistent usage out of it? Is it weekly engaged users? Is it use cases that are solved for? Is it risk mitigated? Is it incidents deferred? Is it what is the how do you define the health of your customer? And I put that sub bullet there because this is something that we even wrestle with internally sometimes. We may say, oh, well, they're using it a lot, and then it comes up for renewal and they churn. We're like, well, what happened? And they're like, well, we've had open tickets for 6 months and you didn't address it. Like, that's bad customer service. So I'm going to go look somewhere else for someone who cares a bit more about me. My voice is heard more. So, like, yes, we were using it because we were paying for you, but I'm going to go look elsewhere where they're going to take care a little bit better care of me. All right. And like we've done a lot of work internally to start to address those more quickly and tie all of the tickets to that individual customer. So we're now getting a full picture of what's going on. It's not just the usage, but it's also the challenges that they're facing. Sort of that voice of the customer that we're pushing things through, whether it be a feature request or a bug. When do we need to prioritize and escalate SLAs around things, right? But like all of that goes into the big picture of the health of that customer. So I wanted to specifically call that one out. The second thing, and I came across this, full disclosure, on LinkedIn. I'm not associated with this concept at all, and it's not something we've adopted internally. But I thought it was really interesting, which is like really, really simplifying down to a single metric what your product value does. And not every application can do this, and we're kind of a complex tool ourselves, so which is why we haven't been able to do it. But I thought it was an interesting way to think about the value proposition to your customer. And the one I always thought was kind of funny was the Tinder example, second from the bottom, which is you would think that an engaged user, what you're really driving are people to be in your app all the time and like swipe, 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 swipe. But they called it out here the bad North Star metric, whereas the good North Star metric is actually the matches. Because if you think about it, if somebody spends a lot of time swiping and they never match, they're probably going to leave the product because they're not getting that value that they're trying to get out of it. And that was kind of the aha moment for me. I'm like, oh yeah, that is okay. Yeah, you don't just want people in it all the time. You want them to see value and experience value from it. And so like maybe think about what that could be for your particular company. Define an enablement strategy for new features. We're getting better at this. I've experienced a lot of time. I have existing vendors where like I feel like every time I go into the UI, the buttons have moved. I can't find where they went. There's a new feature. I have no idea what to do with it. I'm like, great. Maybe there's a little modal for a one box thing that pops up. But like, okay, does that tie to my existing use cases? Is this a new use case? And this is really where customer success can really start to lean in. And it's kind of that continual perpetual feedback loop of like define the use case, document enablement, track adoption, measure ROI, right? Circle, 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 circle for every new feature that comes out. Now, do you have to put as much effort into each one? Maybe not, but I think it's helpful to think about it in that context. Because otherwise you might wind up with a bunch of awesome features out there that your customer never adopts because one, they either don't know it exists, or two, they don't know how to use it. And then track champion engagement and multi-thread. And this is why back to Peter's comment from before. So again, thanks Peter for being my plant. I give it a very specific example for something that I faced internally. I was 2 weeks onto the job here at Productiv, and there was a vendor that was up for renewal. And I just told him, I was like, hey guys, like it was consumption based. We had used, I think, 2 over the course of the year. Nobody knew they existed. I kind of stumbled onto the fact that they were even there. This is a security tool. I'm not going to tell you who they are. And they were trying to increase the cost for the renewal by almost double. They're like, oh, we've added all this extra value in. We're going to increase the cost. You'll get unlimited consumption now. I'm like, guys, I don't know who you are. Nobody in the company knows who you are. And the more I dug into it, it's because they'd had one champion, they hadn't multi-threaded, and that champion left the company. And so nobody knew they existed. And we had a very real challenge internally that they were specifically designed to solve, but they hadn't reached back out. They hadn't, Shareth, where you were going, they hadn't found the new head of security. They hadn't talked to the CTO. They hadn't talked to the CIO. They hadn't gone and talked to anybody else who could have realized the value behind them. And we were this close to churning. Now, to their credit, they went above and beyond. They kept our pricing flat. They bent over to help us like really optimize and adopt. They basically said, hey, if you'll lean in, if you'll be our new champion, we'll meet you in the middle. We'll make sure you get the value out of it. Now, like I'm a very big proponent of them. They've been very tightly baked into our tech stack, but they had to do Herculean efforts to save that. Whereas if they had just been multi-threading the whole time and communicating the ROI to various stakeholders, it would have been much easier and we would have gotten the value out of it as a company. So I'm a very big proponent of that last bullet of multi-thread. And I mean, this is the one time where you really should be patting yourself on the back, vocalizing it to everybody, going back to that ROI from early on, those use cases, report that out, tell everybody, scream from the mountaintops. And a big part, this is actually interesting, another anecdote. We were, and this actually goes back to the intake side of defining the value. For our platform itself, I was just talking to a prospect a few days ago, and they were like, "Oh, well, I want to buy a company like Productiv, and I see the value in it. But every time I get up to talking to my chief finance officer to try to get the budget to do it, they don't get it. I haven't been able to articulate the ROI to them." And so some of this education of our champions, both at the buying side and throughout the life cycle of it, is helping them to communicate the value that we're providing to their organization, whether it be, again, and like, hey, we've reduced the amount of hours needed to do X. We've reduced the amount of risk exposure for the company to Y. We've saved the company money, the amount of money from all the incidents that we've prevented that otherwise we would have had to pay out to remediate and all these other things, right? So like, okay, we'll help them document what that is and communicate it appropriately to their leads. Make them look good. If you make your buyer look good, I guarantee you they will renew, right? Like that's just kind of the core of it. So I'll stop here again. I know I've been talking for a little while. Thoughts on this? Like, I think this is the bread and butter. This is where if we do this well, when it comes time to renewal, we have become sticky. We have demonstrated value. We have delivered on the use cases that we talked about before. And in this very busy marketplace that we're contesting in, this is how we differentiate ourselves. So thoughts?
I have more of a question for you, Josh. I mean, I
Sure.
think you asked this thing about like figure out what is that one thing, your ROI story, right? I mean, look at the folks represented here on the call, right? We got folks from all over, from compliance, endpoint, network, app security, right? Network security, everything. And so in cyber, it's not so straightforward, right? Like Peter can have his own story, I can have my own story, David can have his own story, but do you feel like there is a one unifying framework that we can all align to? Like I'm going to throw NIST out there, right? If you take NIST, CSF, or CIS, right? They've got all, security controls and domains kind of tied to their framework. And everything that we do that's represented on this call can be tied to that framework. What are your thoughts on using that as a sort of single source of truth to kind of convey the ROI because you're tying to best practice standards?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it depends on the customer you're selling into. A lot of organizations these days, I'm sure many of you know, try to align against NIST, sort of the de facto industry standard. There's obviously some that tie more directly to specific industries than others. But sort of the cross-functional, cross-industry framework standard, I think, is kind of the NIST CSF. And a lot of organizations, especially the bigger ones, they're constantly doing maturity assessments. I know back in my consulting days, I did a lot of them, right? I'm sure you did too, Shareth. And they're always looking to say, okay, the starting point is what's our maturity against the framework, and then what technologies, processes, and people can we put in to improve the maturity on the places we think we're lagging behind. And so one way to help your buyers articulate the value that you're delivering is maybe understand where they are today, where they're trying to get. And if you can actually help them move the needle on those, increase it a 0.2, 0.4, a whole point up on the maturity scale. And they can then turn around and articulate that to their board of directors, to their CEO, whoever it may be, who there may be compliance and regulatory obligations. They may be reporting out to the feds for all, if you're supporting banks. If you can make them look good in that capacity, speaking their language in the same language that their bosses and boards understand, that's a great way to articulate value. And understand that they're likely going to have people like I used to be, contractors and consultants come in to assess as a third party. Maybe think about how they're going to perceive the value that your product is. So it's not even just your buyer at that point. It's auditors and assessors that may be seeing the impact of your application. And can you work with them to articulate it better? I think it's a great thought exercise, Shareth. I don't know what other people on the call think, though.
I think we can even simplify it a little more, particularly for the SMB market. I mean, if you're talking, Fortune 50, Fortune 100 companies that can afford those deep analysis, consultants or whatever. But I actually kind of scale it back to, particularly for the mid-market commercial, lower commercial market, is the framework is, do you know your customer? Why did they buy the product? What are their desired outcomes? And are they getting there? And it really can be that simple, because that is going to dictate their ROI. You said you wanted to achieve this, you wanted to lower these numbers or whatever. And let's review that. And I think if you review that on a regular basis, whether it's the weekly, bi-weekly, monthly touch point meeting, or it's a QBR where you're going to dive a little deeper, you continually say, I know you as a customer. I know why you brought the product. And by the way, has anything changed in, from your perspective? And if you can align those and consistently, you're not going to get surprised on churn, because you know you're validating that they're getting that value.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We're in
Any other
technology.
thoughts?
We tend to overcomplicate often, and sometimes simple's better.
Yep. Yep. I absolutely agree with you. The only other thing I would add to it is just be able to measure it. If you can get them to
Absolutely.
agree to some kind of number, and then you can continuously demonstrate to them. I've seen all too often where the vendor may actually be doing what was expected, but they were bad at articulating the value that they provided, and at the end of the year, they're potentially on the chopping block solely because they couldn't articulate it well enough. They didn't measure it throughout, and they didn't empower their champion to then be able to communicate effectively. So yeah. I mean, if you can, and that was kind of where I was going with the North Star metric. I fully acknowledge that there's complexities behind it, which is why we haven't adopted it either. But I thought it's a good thought process of how simple can you make it and measure and be able to articulate in whatever capacity that is.
Agreed.
Cool. Any other thoughts? Like, that's it for my slides. I think this has been a great engaging conversation. I know we've got about 8 or 9 minutes left. So happy to take this in any other direction anybody would like. Don't everybody go at once.
Questions?
No, Josh, I just want to make a comment that, everything that you shared with us today definitely relevant, and I have a few gems that I took away as well, and that we know is a constant challenge, right? And the top of mind is definitely the scope creep, right? The reason being is that sometimes when we have an engagement to help customer implement, integrate, and whatnot, and especially on the OneTrust side, that we have a pretty good portfolio that tie all the compliances and regulation, and then halfway through regulation change, right? And then because of that, the use case is now also changing, right? So it's often enough a hard conversation. So you give me specifically, a couple of reminder and things that I definitely will bring back and share with my team. So thank you.
Awesome. Love that.
Thank you. That was great.
I think you definitely validated a lot of the things that I think folks on the call are already doing, Josh. Like, I'll tell you one thing, right? Obviously, tracking multiple stakeholders is great. We know it's the right thing to do, but the constraint we have, it's operationally very expensive. And a lot of companies are making cuts in CS and operations. So yeah, we know what the right thing to do, but at the same time, we're constrained with resources and time, which is what makes our jobs super challenging.
Totally. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, you all get this, but you kind of got to take the risk-based approach, right? Talking to people who work in security spaces. What's the biggest bang for the buck? Our VP of customer success, what does she call it? Our infatuation list, I think is what it is. It's like, what are the biggest brands? What are the biggest logos? Who are the highest paying customers? Like, I hate to say it, but not all customers are created equal. We want them all to be successful, but in terms of the resources that we can provide to them, can't give the same to everybody, nor should you. They're not paying for it. And so being intentional about where you allocate those resources. So like, do I go multi-thread with a $10,000 account? Probably not. Do I multi-thread with a $2 million account? I want to know every single person on the executive board, the executive team, right? I'm going to take every one of them to lunch. And so it's just being realistic about where you apply your time and your capacity and resources.